Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome everybody to a special NJBIZ panel on the subject of crisis management. My name is Howard Burns, and I'm the editor of NJBIZ. This morning, we have a very distinguished panel of experts, and they will be introduced shortly, but I want to introduce our moderator, who we are very privileged to have this morning, and that is Lieutenant Governor Kim Guadagno. Kim is now a partner at Connell, Foley, and as a partner there, she counsels clients on local, state, and federal initiatives, economic development projects, and various policy issues while assisting them in all aspects of litigation. In her 8 years as New Jersey's first Lieutenant Governor and the 33rd Secretary of State, Kim Guadagno was an advocate for businesses and corporations statewide, creating an effective infrastructure for economic growth and job creation. Kim is an attorney by trade, having served in private practice and as a federal and state prosecutor for more than 3 decades. She also taught at Rutgers Law for 6 years. The Lieutenant Governor is a graduate of American University, Washington College of Law, and Ursinus College. She's married to Judge Michael Guadagno, now retired, and has 3 sons. It is my great pleasure to introduce Kim Guadagno.
Thank you, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. The first thing I need to let you all know is that if you need to use your cell phones, you can go right ahead and do it. And if you need a cup of coffee, please, I'm not going to be shy about getting one. You should not be either. And there is some good food, great food over here. So we're going to have a fabulous panel discussion. As Howard said already, we have 3 experts sitting in front of you right now. Our problem, quite frankly, is keeping the topics to a 10-minute clip. We're going to have 4 topics today: financial crises, criminal crises, data breaches, and harassment, or the Me Too movement. I don't think you can even begin to touch the surface of any of those topics in the time allotted. So I think what we'd like to do is just tweak your curiosity, let you think about some of these subject matters, and then at the end, what we're going to have is a Q&A, so you can do a deeper dive with any of the panel members if that's what you'd like to do. And certainly you'll have access to their contact information in the files in front of you, or in the handouts in front of you right now. I want to thank Connell Foley especially for giving me this opportunity to take some time out in the morning and talk to you directly. I want to thank the panel members before we get started, because whether you like it or not, it takes a long time to prepare for some of these topics, because I'm going to keep them to 3 minutes, and it's not going to be easy. And so without saying much more, then let's get started. First, we're going to ask each panel member to introduce themselves. Please do not be humble. I have learned over the last 10 years, if you do not toot your own horn, no one will toot it for you. So NJBIZ wants you to know, the room to know who you are and why you are the expert in the fields that you are. So we're going to start right now with Chris sitting immediately to my right.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Lukach. I run a consultancy called AKCG Public Relations Counselors. We've operated for about 35 years prior to that under the name Ankline Communications Group, named after our founder. We changed it just this year because after 35 years, we were finally tired of being confused with the fashion brand and getting their broken handbags and headshots and broken watches sent to our office. So AKCG is what we are. For the longest time, a business like ours, we're purely public relations oriented. We're purely reputational. For the longest time, a business like ours was a model of waiting for the red phone to blink and ring. And I'm happy to say that in the last 5 years or so, we've sort of seen that shift in the type of work that we do. Now, work like ours is centered on preparedness. It's centered on working with our clients in non-crisis oriented times to help sort of train their antenna, make sure they have the right sensitivities, make sure they have the right cultural competencies, make sure they're removing all the barriers to successful crisis management when the time comes. And that's an evolution I'm sure we'll speak to today, and I'll spare you the rest. It's in your handout.
Right, you don't want to take away from the rest of the conversation. The next is Charlie McKenna. Charles.
I know a little bit about crises because I've caused a few of them in my day. I think that's why I'm here.
I will vouch for that.
I presently work at Renaissance Associates, and I'm the general counsel and managing director there. We do investigations, digital forensics, forensic accounting, and workplace and school violence avoidance. Before that, I worked for the state. For 2 years, I was the director of the Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness. I was counsel to the governor. And then for the last 4 years, before I went to Renaissance, I was the CEO of the Schools Development Authority. So I know a little bit about schools construction and safety.
So I'm going to add the following. Charlie was also in the United States Attorney's Office immediately after 9/11, and he was also in the governor's office during Sandy. So an expert in many crises of all sorts. So, and now at the end, Joel Payne.
Hi, everyone. Joel Payne. I'm a vice president with the corporate communications and public affairs practice for MWWPR, which is a New Jersey born and bred firm based up in East Rutherford. We have a large office in New York City as well. I actually sit in our Washington, D.C. office, but I do a lot of work up here in the area. Pleasure to be with you. My background is very heavily heeled in politics, similar to the Lieutenant Governor. I've worked in the Senate and the House. I've worked for 2 presidential campaigns. I'm really good at picking losing presidential candidates. So if you need any advice on that, really, really good at that. That's been really foundational in terms of how I approach addressing crises, not just addressing them in the moment, but predicting them and trying to head them off before you get to the crisis point. Charlie and I had a good conversation before the panel started about that. And so I'm interested in getting into that more as we talk. One other thing I'd also point out, I've done a lot of crisis work from the corporate reputation, high level corporate messaging standpoint too. So, again, looking forward to your questions, looking forward to a good discussion here, and pleased to be with you.
All right, so let's get started. The small, tiny little topic we're going to spend 10 minutes on right now is the financial crises. So the question first to Joel, if it's okay with you, Joel, we'll start at the end. Let's say your client is facing a financial crisis. What was it, and how did you handle it?
And this is probably going to be the start of a lot of answers where we talk around some of our crisis work. Probably rule number 1 that everybody can figure out here is because it's crisis work, you could talk around it, you can't talk about it. Early in my career, one of the bigger banks in the country had some issues around the bailout, as I'm sure many of you remember about a decade plus ago. One thing that was really important was fact gathering, because it had been that's where I start. Doing your research, kind of doing your homework so that you understand what the dynamics are, and building that cachet of information so that you can actually educate not just the public, but educate your key stakeholders. So your customer base, your partners, your investors. That was something that I found to be very, very important. So that's an important place to start. It's just that fact gathering. The second thing, and I talked on this a little bit before, is what I've always found, and it's not just with our financial clients that we've worked with, but all of them, is that really they're reacting to the crisis in the moment. So in other words, they have not done a lot of the prep work that goes into being effectively prepared for a crisis. I like to say if your first action in reacting to a crisis is calling a person like myself at MWWPR or like Chris, you're at that point, you're mitigating losses. Right. So I really, really try to emphasize the importance of being ahead of the curve and understanding what your liabilities are, what your vulnerabilities are, and getting a counselor in there to help make sure that you have a very, very tight circle of key people in the organization who can make decisions. That's another thing I learned from that first crisis experience that I talked about with that large bank, is that there were so many people who were making decisions. It was decentralized. And so it was really hard to figure out, how do you get to a quick decision point? So those are just a couple of observations that I have.
Okay. So we'll just come down this way and then we'll mix it up. Charlie, have you dealt with a financial crisis, and how did you deal with it?
I mean, I think I'm going to deal with crises a little more macro level. I mean, I think the first thing that any company really should be doing is putting together a crisis sort of management or study team to be looking at the organization, look at the vulnerabilities of the organization, and then starting to put together a plan for how you're going to deal with any crises. In any given crisis, there's going to be a number of aspects of that plan that are going to cut across any crises that you have. So who your management team is, who's going to do the communications for you, and then you can have appendices to that plan for specific types of crises that you think that your organization is going to face. So that when there is a crisis, you can pull out the plan, you can see who should be doing what, and then you can go to that particular appendix and see, in this particular crisis, what boxes we need to check off. One of the things you need to do is when you put that plan together, you'll realize that you may have to do some training, or you may have to buy some equipment or supplies for that plan. So you want to train to that plan, and then you want to practice the plan, whether you actually practice it or whether you sit down and do a tabletop. So after Hurricane Andrew in Florida, the telephone companies there realized that they had a shortage. Not a shortage of telephone poles or wires or switches. There was a shortage of daycare centers. Because what happened was Andrew wiped out all the daycare centers. Many of their employees had children, and they didn't come to work. That was something that they had not planned for. So on the fly, they had to call in. What they did was they called in a lot of their retirees. They set up makeshift rooms in their offices. They set up daycare centers for their people. Then people were able to come in and do the work. So when they went through the plan, they realized that they hadn't seen a problem. And I can bet you that that is now in their plan, that they've got to take care of that. Then you really want to update that plan as things change. The plan is very important. And then when you have a crisis, it's important that you see it as a crisis. And you don't let that crisis fester and then overcome you. You want to have a spokesperson. When there's a crisis, I'll leave to the communications folks, but the organization has to speak with one voice. And you've got to make sure that that person is designated and that everybody knows that, so that when the press calls or anybody calls, they get funneled to that particular individual. Because if you're having disparate messages come out of the organization, it just adds to the public perception that you're incapable of doing that. Communications during this period is key. Again, I don't want to usurp their stuff, but communications to your own employees. You don't want your own employees finding out about what you're doing on the 6 o'clock news. It kills morale. You're going to have suppliers and customers that you're going to have to message maybe perhaps differently. The general public may be a different message. You've got to manage social media. All of those things have to happen. So if you look at a financial crisis, which almost all crises are, look at Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo had a situation where they had vulnerabilities that they never addressed. So they had a compensation package that paid employees bonuses if they got people to get more of the bank's services.
So Charlie, hold on one second. Bankers in the room, I know. Bankers in the room, right.
There you go.
Lawyers in the room? Okay. Sorry, go ahead, finish.
So they had a compensation package that gave employees bonuses if they were able to increase that business, coupled with the fact that they had very onerous quotas on those banks. So if a bank didn't meet its literally daily quota, that number that they were short, it got added to the next one. That was a recipe for disaster for that bank, because basically people started just adding bank accounts to other people. And they were getting bonuses, B, they were meeting their quotas, everybody was happy. In 2013, the bank realized that this was a problem and they had to fire 30 people for that. But they still didn't see this as a crisis, and they let it fester, so that 3 years later in 2016, then they had to fire 5,300 people, and it turned out that they had about $2 million bank accounts that had been set up falsely. They didn't deal with it well. Then they didn't communicate it well. They sent their CEO into the Senate to have a Senate hearing, totally unprepared for what was going to happen, and the CEO got crushed on national television. Elizabeth Warren took him apart and just disassembled him right there. Asked him why he was the CEO, why he had not been fired, why the bank had not clawed back any of the money from all of these people, and everyone watched that. The bank did not do a sufficient internal investigation, so the crisis really crushed them in 2016. But in 2017, the bank had to come out then and admit that they had retaliated against people who tried to report these things to the bank. They also had to report that they had written 535,000 insurance policies. So, but they had to, what happens is when you have a crisis.
It's good that I've known him for 25 years.
When you have a crisis, you've got to get it over with.
Right.
And so you can't like keep pulling the scab off the wound. And so as we sit here today in 20 2018 going into 2019, Wells Fargo is still dealing with the fallout of that. And so that's a crisis that in many ways, perhaps they managed okay, but in a lot of ways they managed poorly. And that's sort of what can happen to you.
Chris, why don't you, if you want to speak to the Wells Fargo debacle, I think that's fair to say. It was a debacle. Or if you want to talk about a financial crisis you might have handled, or I can give you something a little less sexy, like one of your clients has a lien put on his home, and that means his whole entire reputation is hurt because he's no longer financially adept at managing people's money. Maybe that's another simple example.
If I may, Lieutenant Governor, let me speak to sort of one of the principles of financial crises first, which is of all the topics that we've teed off for discussion today, financial crises are probably both the broadest and in some sense perhaps the most desirable of all we're talking about. And the reason for that is it's broad because, it touches...
Did you hear that, you guys? The bankers in the back.
The most desirable. And I'll say it for this reason, and there's a reason for that, but the broadest because everything, as Charlie astutely put it, everything is in some sense a financial crisis. Any, reputation, public relations, I'll advocate, as I'm sure my colleagues will on the panel, reputation is a bottom line discipline. Public relations matters because it limits your ability to function operationally. It limits your ability to make money. Sometimes financial crises are the root cause. Sometimes financial crises are the aftermath of something like an ethical breach. In terms of the desirability, when financial crises are sort of the root cause, it's not a bad thing because of all the topics we're talking about, it's the one that you should be least surprised by. It's the one that we should have, as Joel sort of advocated for, the chance to prepare for. And if we're not doing that, there's any number of reasons. Number one, it could be that a lack of perspective, a lack of poorly trained antenna. It could be the fact that culturally we don't respect the communications process as well as we should. But I'll say this to Lieutenant Governor's question: no crisis exists, no reputational crisis exists in a vacuum. No one's forming their opinion on just that crisis alone. There's always some corollary. There's always some related effect. And one of the things we try to do when we get involved in counseling a client is understand if you're a hospital and you're about to undergo a financial crisis, we have to look at where your metrics are in terms of your morale with employees. We have to recognize the corollary between poor financial performance and the perception of quality. And we have to understand that. And we have to speak to the quality message as much as we do about finances. If it's some sort of ethically minded, ethically driven financial crisis, we have to look to that and underscore and espouse the ethics that we subscribe to. So it really is a game in some sense of looking at what the root cause is. And to your example of the individual
something simple like that.
Yeah. The question that we have to ask is, what do the employees think? Where's the baseline understanding? How is this going to feed into their existing perceptions? We don't worry about media coverage in the abstract ever. We worry about media coverage because it has the potential to move the dial with people that already know who we are and already have ideas of who we are.
So how interesting was it that both Charlie and Chris mentioned the fact that employee morale, Joel, I apologize, I wasn't focusing on it until I heard it from the two other panel members. Employee morale is crucial. So Chris, how would you handle employee morale?
Well, you have to get a sense of how what's natural, what's innate. I mean, one of the reasons that we don't like to come in at the end of a crisis, and we don't really like to do too much Monday morning quarterbacking, though we'll undoubtedly do some of that today, is that you have to communicate in a way that's consistent. You have to communicate in a way that's natural, that's innate, that's consistent with your company culture. I'll say one thing. It's a little easier to talk about what doesn't work. And what doesn't work is statements. What doesn't work is distance. I mean, we're learning more and more about the ways in which we communicate and we process messages in this day and age. And, our instinct is, let's have a vetted statement, let's have a letter. People read letters and they read statements to find fault within them. People look to find common ground when they're sitting eye to eye with someone, when they're making human contact, when they're sharing a meal.
You mean 141 character tweet is not exactly what you call communication?
Maybe if you have two of them and you squeeze them together.
Joel is itching to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to add that I think great points were made here, and I wanted to pick up on something. I talked about this earlier about the importance of kind of research, and I'll call it discovery, that discovery phase early on. And again, I come from a political background. So, one of my first jobs in politics was being a self-researcher, which is essentially find out all the dirt on yourself. Okay, let's take it to a corporate context. When you're approaching a crisis, when you're thinking about a crisis, you have to figure out what's going on. You have to get a full idea of the scope of your problem, because you cannot have rolling disclosures. Okay, rolling disclosures is probably the thing that can cause the most damage to a company from a reputation standpoint. It is, Charlie talked about pull the scab off right away. I totally agree with that. Get an understanding of all of the information that is out there that could be harmful, manage it, figure out how do you get it out early, get it out efficiently so you can move on and turn the page. Because if you don't, all you're going to do is prolong the story. We've got some very resourceful reporters in the room here. And I'm sure what keeps them in business a lot of times is people continually drip, 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 drip with rolling disclosures. So I can't underscore enough how important I think that is in terms of effectively managing a crisis, be it financial particularly, but really across the board.
It's like, get it right, get it quick, get it out, and get it over. Right?
Yeah.
Mess up if you mess up, right?
And
All right, so let's move on to another topic, and that is criminal matters. Those of you that are members of the boards like I am, if I've been a federal prosecutor, I know it's okay to get a grand jury subpoena. I suspect that most of you would have a heart attack if someone came up to you and handed you a grand jury subpoena, a federal or a state one. I'm going to start with Chris because we kind of cut you off. So Chris, have you had a client in a criminal matter? You don't have to tell us their name unless you were successful, and then maybe you want to. How did you face the criminal investigation? And again, we're going to try to stick to about 3 minutes.
Yeah, I like to think we're successful. That doesn't quite change the NDA, but one point I'll make before.
Now, the NDA means non-disclosure agreement.
One point I'll make before I will get specific. I promise. But there's one thing that I think really needs to be said to sort of set the stage for this conversation, because we're all keeping an eye toward reputation, which is, one of our maxims is you can win in the court of law but lose in the court of public opinion. And reputational risk is not tethered to actual criminal wrongdoing. It's only tethered to the perception of potential criminal wrongdoing. We need that sensitivity. And as we communicate through criminal investigations, through criminal matters, we have to operate with the understanding that there is a perception of wrongdoing. I was in Bend, Oregon 2 weeks ago doing a crisis training for a facility there. And one of the scenarios we always use, and by the way, if you don't do this, please do this. You just get your team together, give them a scenario. It doesn't even need to be all that detailed, and say, what would we say? How would we say it? Who's the team that's going to review this? Who's the team that's going to assess this? And do it. Give yourself 15 minutes to do it, because that's what the media landscape allows today. The reality is we have to begin communicating before we have specific information. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So the premise I posed was, let's presume the police come in with a warrant. They take out an employee. They clean out the employee's locker. They clean out the employee's hard drives. They take it with you, and it's somewhere in the warrant that there's suspicion of child pornography within this. And the instinct of this group I was training, which is a very skilled and very intelligent group, was to say, well, we're withholding judgment. We believe in due process here. We believe, and that kind of highlights one of the never-ending conflicts within our industry, which is the conflict between logical responses and emotional responses. And you can't answer emotion with logic, and you really shouldn't answer logic with emotion. And our instinct is to be deferential, is to give people benefits of the doubt. When we're trying to communicate through difficult times, what we have to reassure people of is our values.
So what's the right answer?
What we stand. Well, I mean, in that case,
they all want to know what the answer is.
In that case, perhaps it's something of, we demand that our employees uphold a high standard of ethics, both inside and outside the workplace. We're deeply concerned about these investigations, about these allegations, and we're going to take this very seriously. You don't have to reach a conclusion, but you don't have to be affording them, constitutional rights in the reputational
No, you just threw them right under the bus.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. You know, our values are not necessarily an assessment on one individual, but there's this conflict between logic and emotion. And what's important is our employees knowing that we hold a high standard of ethical conduct.
Charlie?
The first thing I would do if I became under investigation was do not destroy anything. That's all I'll say. Don't go to the shredder, and don't let anybody see you even near the shredder. I also think that you should never take a criminal investigation lightly. Just because you did nothing wrong, unless you're a sole proprietor, you shouldn't feel comfortable, because your employees may not share the same moral fiber that you do. And I found this out the hard way. Oftentimes they will lie to you. And if you trust them, you do so at your own peril. After that, you want to hire a lawyer. And it's important to know who the client is going to be in this particular instance, right? So is the client going to be the board of directors? Is the client going to be a special committee of the board of directors? Who is that going to be? And you don't have to know the answer to this, but you need to talk to the lawyer about it. And if the lawyer seems not to understand it, then you have to hire another lawyer. And in fact, I would say if the lawyer doesn't bring it up in the first instance, think about hiring another lawyer. Because all of this is going to go to the attorney-client privilege and whether or not you're going to have to disclose what the attorney found out at that particular time. If you're the subject of a criminal investigation, you will soon be involved in civil litigation. And they will want to know about all the things that the lawyer found out, because you're probably also going to want to have an investigation. And you don't want to, you want to be in a position later on where you can have the choice as to whether to turn that information over or not. And that choice is going to be given to you by whether that's protected by the attorney-client privilege. So who the client is going to be very important. Also, I think you need to have sort of a crisis management team while you're under investigation, because the company has to continue to run and people have to operate that. And you want them to keep their eye on the ball, but then you want a smaller subset of your organization that's going to deal with just this investigation so that both sides can work together and the company can move forward. You want the law firm to conduct an investigation because decisions are going to have to be made and you're going to want to have the most knowledge possible about that. Public companies may have to make disclosures right away. Non-public companies are going to have to make a disclosure at some particular point in time. And you want to have as much information as is humanly possible to do that. So in my experience, the more information you have, the more you can control the dialogue and not have leaks from the prosecutor's office control the dialogue.
Charlie, so you're taking from the lawyer's standpoint, would you have the communications person already in place? This is back to your all of your points of planning this out.
My communications person is always going to be, my plan has that person in place all the time. And not only that person, but who, if that person has a heart attack or can't make it to work that day, who the second person
And he's
is.
on the payroll, so he's subject to attorney-client privilege so that you don't get yourself in trouble civilly, right? Yeah.
The privilege is very important, and you don't have to know that. That's why you hire lawyers. Make sure the lawyer gets it right, or lawyers thinking about it. And if they're not, like I said, hire another lawyer, because it's really important.
Joel?
Yeah, or quick thing on that, and then I wanted to make another point. Regarding the attorney-client privilege, a lot of times what I found that we work with, they will hire the lawyer and the lawyer will hire us. Right. And so when the lawyer hires us, that gives you that attorney-client privilege. So if I'm not obviously, if I'm working for company X, I don't work directly for them, but if I work for their attorney, that creates that extra layer of protection, and I think that's something important to elevate as well. Mm-hmm. You know, something else I wanted to bring up, and I think about these things from a reputation standpoint, because the same way Chris and Charles talked about how everything is financial, I think everything is reputation too. Mm-hmm. For MWW, we commissioned a research survey called CorpSumer, which is essentially, you know, the shorthand version of how I would describe it is everything you make, every decision you make as a corporation is values based. In other words, when people decide who they want to patronize, whether it's they want to buy a car from someone, or they want to go to ShopRite, or go to whatever, go to a grocery store, wherever, they are making decisions not just about what's the best price, what's the best product, but also who shares our values. And I think it's important to think about this from a crisis standpoint, because consumers increasingly, what we found, are making those decisions around those values discussions.
Now, be a little more specific, because I'm not sure I understand.
So what I'm saying, Lieutenant Governor, is this. if you are a company that does business with another business that does not share your values, let's say, be it your not religious values, but I'm trying to think of something somewhat innocuous.
How about this? I'm a lawyer. I represent a certain ShopRite grocery store, and one of my partners then goes out and represents Wegmans. Is that kind of thing?
No, I would say in the shop, and forgive, I'm sorry for anyone who's maybe works with ShopRite here. But
these are all hypotheticals. I didn't say who owned the ShopRite.
A grocer, maybe someone in your supply chain does business that you don't agree with, be it maybe the products they get aren't sustainable, or there was a crisis that they did not handle appropriately. Maybe there was a harassment scandal. They are making decisions, they being consumers, are making decisions more increasingly based on not just, again, what's the best price, what's the best product, but do you share my values? Do we look at the world the same way? And we see it all across the board.
Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A is
a great example. And one other point on this. We see what's the first thing when consumers want to make a point now. What's the first thing that you see? There's a TV show that someone doesn't agree with. What's the first thing they do? They go after their sponsors. They go after their financial backers. And again, I think it's important to consider that as you're thinking about your crisis response, because again, that all feeds into everything that we're talking about here about reputation, because ultimately your reputation is your currency.
And I think the same thing is your employees, which are your biggest asset. Their morale is going to be based upon their perception of what happens in the public. So you see Facebook now, which has sort of this creeping crisis, which is ongoing. And they did a recent poll of Facebook employees, and they are no longer so enamored of working for that company. So Facebook is going to have problems attracting good talent, and now they're going to have problems keeping the good talent that they have because they'd perhaps rather go to some other company. It's all very important, and it ties back. And the message that you put out there has an effect on the marketplace and internally on your own people, which are like I said, your important asset.
Perfect segue to the next topic. I told you, these are only 30,000. We could spend an hour on each one of these, but I want to try to give them some taste of this. And so you mentioned Facebook, so let's talk a little bit about data breaches. Have you been asked to manage a data breach? And it could be as small as somebody hacking your account and sending your money someplace else, I talked about with the bankers, or as big as Marriott last week, or everything that you've seen through Facebook. I think we should start with Charlie because we ended with Charlie.
I think if you have a data breach, the first inclination may be to say we're the victim of a crime and now we want to go to law enforcement. And I would counsel you that law enforcement is probably not the first place that you want to go. Because once you go to law enforcement, you are going to lose a certain amount of control over what's going on. I would actually go out and hire a company that has an expertise in this data breach area, because before you go to the authorities, which eventually you'll have to get to, I think you really want to get your arms around what the problem was. You want to know how it was breached. You want to know how the breach has affected you. You want to know how the breach has affected your customers. Like Joel said, you do not want to, as many companies have said, this breach has affected 2 million people. A month later, it's affected 5 million people. 2 weeks later, it's affected 15 million people. So you need to get a company in that's going to be able to.
What kind of company? What kind of?
So there's a company like mine, or there's many companies.
I get this.
No, there are many companies out there that will come in and will look at your breach. How were you breached? Whose fault was it? How do you stop the breach if it's continuing? How large was the breach, and what is the fallout from that breach? So
was it the first time you had this breach?
Right. So a digital forensics company will come in and will be able to do all of that for you, or should be able to do all of that for you, to get your arms around it. Then once you have your arms around it, and the timeline for these types of things, I think, is not as critical as the timeline for something that immediately gets into the press, because you have a certain amount of control. Now, you will be criticized if you do not disclose these data breaches quickly, but I would say that you have days rather than hours to work with this. You probably don't have weeks, but if you have a data breach, you don't have to immediately run out and disclose it. You probably can take almost a week to figure out what that data breach is. When you've done that, Then you can work with your people as to how you're going to message it, and then you can bring law enforcement in. But you bring law enforcement in right away, and then you're going to be dealing with leaks. You're not going to have control over the situation. So I would say control is what you want, a knowledge of what has happened so that you know the full universe of what has happened, and then you deal with the folks to my right and left as to how it is that you're going to message this.
Okay. And Chris is itching to respond to that. And
Well-
I'm so tempted to just go to Joel, but I won't. I'm kidding.
Cruel.
I'm
That'd be
kidding.
cruel.
I'm kidding.
No, I mean, I'll say this. Disclosure is a risk if anyone within the organization knows. We can't just contain it to the bigger the team knows that's responding to it, the greater the risk becomes of potential leak. The leakiest area of any organization is usually the board of directors and the board of trustees.
Hey.
I'm one too, but I mean, they are sieves, and so we want to contain that, and Target. When you look back at Target a couple years ago, when they had a massive breach, their data loss was not disclosed by Target first. It was by who's the guy? I can't remember the watchdog that sees it, and it took Target I think 9 days to issue their first statement. That is a massive window of time through which opinions are being formed, and Target's lucky to have that kind of brand equity. Most companies don't. But let me tell you why, from a reputational standpoint, so many companies do data loss so poorly. And the reason for that is I think it's 49 state legislatures now, maybe all 50, have on their books something that prescribes how one must communicate in a data loss event. If it's over 500 people that are materially breached, it has to be within 90 days or without undue delay. I'm not qualified to quote these, but I'm doing it in general terms. When you have such a specific and detailed roadmap to follow for your disclosure, communicating becomes less about instinct and it becomes more about compliance. And then you see organizations pushing it to day 88, 89 before they do their disclosure like they should. I'll tell you what's in every single news article about a data loss. While the company originally discovered it in June, it did not disclose it until October. Okay? And data loss is an emotional thing for people. Let me give you an example of where this can sort of cloud judgment. And I really did work on this case. It was out of state. It was a hospital with a large OB unit. They had lost, now, as most data loss is, it's not state-sponsored terrorists. This was somebody who let the wrong unencrypted thumb drive fall out of their pocket in like a Chili's booth or something. That's where most data loss events come from. So on this unencrypted thumb drive were the names of patients. I don't think it was their social. And it, among other things, it had the outcomes of their pregnancies. Oh. This was released. And the first time we got the call to come in and advise on them, the first thing they said was, great news, nothing financial, only 480 people were affected, so we don't have to disclose this. Good job, everybody. Let's, and the instinct for me is think about how this feels to these people that had this information violated. No, we are going to disclose this because it's the morally responsible thing to do and because we don't want anyone else telling the story for us. So when there's such a clear roadmap, it really does enforce bad decision-making from communications, and treat communications, let it be guided by your ethical compass and your moral compass, not by what's required from a compliance standpoint.
Okay. Joel?
Just briefly, I think two gentlemen have covered it pretty well, but I'll add this. We've talked a lot about disclosures here, and I completely agree, particularly related to what Chris talked about getting it out early enough to make sure you're doing the morally responsible thing. I think that's absolutely important. But there are different types of disclosures, right? There are different ways you can disclose. There's a press release that is sent out that is meant to inform but not meant to inflame. Yeah. And then there's a press conference, which you can book at the press club and have 100 of your best friends there, and they can talk about it all week. In other words, you want to be thoughtful about the type of disclosure that you're doing, when you're doing it. That all matters. We worked with a major healthcare company that had a data breach, and their instincts was to do kind of like a large media tour. And we actually advised them against it. Mm-hmm. One, now again, we said to Chris's point, you want to do the responsible thing here, and you want to disclose, and you want to maintain that trust, and you want to do what's right by the public trust. but you don't want to inflame the situation, not just for your reputation, but also because of the effect that it could have on other parts of your supply chain or others who may be impacted by the business implications and ramifications of that. And we found that to be a successful way to approach that situation as well. So I would also kind of put a laser focus on the type of disclosure. That matters as well.
And I'll just say also, we've been talking about data breaches where people steal the data. But if you look at the Sony situation where people took the emails and those emails were incredibly embarrassing, it just brings the point up, and this goes back even to litigation, that you have constantly got to impress upon your folks that when they write an email, before they press the send button, they have to think about whether or not they want to see that on the front page above the fold of the New York Times. And you cannot be too informal or too crass when you're writing emails. That's a problem. And I'll just also throw in the fact that a lot of breaches are when people lose the computer, get stolen, but phishing, when people are coming into your computer systems and somebody clicks on a hyperlink, and that hyperlink basically will bring the bad guys into your computer system. We regularly have our IT department do a phishing expedition in our own to find out if our employees have been taken in by that. And then we educate them on that, because that's the way a lot of places come in, and you don't want to do that. So you've got to be prepared for that.
Right, and there are firms that you can hire. My firm, Connell, Foley, has a cybersecurity unit that does exactly that, manages the breach, tests the breach, hires people like Charlie's group and communications people to manage all that. They have a plan in place. That kind of thing happens on a regular basis. I'm fairly certain that the banks here have a similar process in place. But the one thing I'd like to mention is that you cannot update it enough. Every day there's there's a CIO in the room, so I'm singing to the choir here. He should be sitting at the panel. But you cannot update it enough. You cannot ask the question enough. Am I exposed in some way? So we're going to end this topic there, because again, we could spend a whole day on it. But I want to move to the last one. In New Jersey, we have one of, if not the most progressive gender pay statutes in the country, quite frankly. And every one of your businesses right now are subject to the new rules. And the new rules are basically you have to pay everyone the same amount of money for similar work. And I am grossly generalizing in that legislation, in that statute. But what we're going to have and what you're going to see over the next couple of months, because it is also the Attorney Self-Employment Act, plaintiffs' attorneys get trebled attorney's fees, and the plaintiff themselves get treble damages. You're going to see litigation in the area of sexual harassment. You're going to see more litigation in the area of gender pay. And so I think that we need to talk about it frankly, and I'd like to spend maybe the last 10 minutes we have in the subject area talking about how you will prepare for something that is inevitable. My clients, I say the following: you don't want to be the first. And so go in, do your study, make sure everybody's getting equal pay. You're faced with the problem of, if you find the problem of somebody's not getting paid equal pay, you got to fix the problem. Then how do you manage the problem when the lawsuits come? And remember, the statute of limitations in the gender pay area go back at least from the first illegal check, meaning you could go back to as far as 2009 and continue and renews itself every illegal paycheck. So you could go forward to 2024. This is not a problem that's going away. This is a cutting edge problem. So I'm going to start. Who have I not started with? Joel? Joel, how do you handle, and there's really little doubt in my mind that your firm has handled the Me Too, harassment, gender pay type of situation, Roger Ailes kind of issue, crisis in your experience.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's certainly a reality of where we are today. Unfortunately, in terms of where we are as a society, I'd say fortunately, because we are more aware now, all of us, about behavior in the workplace. We kind of know it when we see it now, and it's something that, just measuring from the start of my career to now, it has changed dramatically, I'd say for the better, in terms of people being aware of their behavior. So that's one. I want to introduce two ideas here. One, diversity. Two, crisis culture. I think diversity is a very important tool to help prepare related to crisis, related to Me Too. Here's why. any room where everybody looks the same, you're gonna have homogenous opinions, and you're gonna have homogenous perspectives, and you're not gonna have a wealth of understanding of how, whether it's someone's race, their ethnicity, their religion, their gender, etc. You're not going to have that full perspective on what people may feel is a certain, offends in a certain way if you don't have that. So we advise our clients to also think about, in terms of from a preparation strategy, do you have a really kind of diverse, are your settings diverse? Because that will help guard against some of this when we talk about preparation. So that's something you can get ahead of the curve on. You can make sure that the rooms where decisions are being made are filled with different types of people. Again, gender, race, religion, etc. So that's one. Two, crisis culture. And when I say crisis culture, it's instead of writing down a full description of what happened in an email, it's saying, hey, I want to talk to you offline about what happened. And again, it's about reputation mitigate. It's about mitigating, damage to your reputation. It's being thoughtful about, is that discoverable? That's a conversation that I've had a lot more in the last decade than I ever would have thought I ever had. Is working in government, even there were certain platforms that you communicate on that are discoverable versus not discoverable. Mm-hmm. So again, even being thoughtful about that. Is this communications channel discoverable versus this other one? Those are all questions, and frankly, you need a good lawyer to help advise you on what the local statutes are and what the local, expectations are related to that. But those are just two ideas that I'd like to introduce there. One, diversity. Two, crisis culture.
Okay, great. Let's jump to Chris, and then we'll end up with Charlie.
Two things about sort of the modern response and to Me Too type and crises of sexual abuse, which is a considerable portion of our firm's work lately. This crisis is a reaffirmation of another sort of maxim of crisis management, which is that statute of limitations is a purely legal concept. It is not a reputational one. And you see organizations from dioceses to schools to organizations of all shapes and sizes paying the price for their predecessors who are long gone, long dead. It doesn't matter. You still have to be respectful of tone and respectful of experience. I worked with, this was a pretty high profile independent school that I was working with, a private school, also out of state. And they reached out to me. It was a New Year's Day one day, and they said, we got to talk to you.
Wait a minute. What day was it?
New Year's Day.
Just wanted to make the point that crises occur all the time.
Oh yeah.
There's no timetable.
We had one that Christmas too.
Not just at weekends.
But it was New Year's Day, and they said, there was the head of school that called and said, someone is taking over our social media feed at our school. And they keep writing, I was abused at your school in 1978, and I tried to tell people then, and no one cared. And they were posting it in every single comment on this Facebook thread. And the head of school says, they have no right to do this, so I just deleted them all. And I said, well, what that says is no one was listening in 1978. And by the way, no one's listening now. We may not have legal liability for what happened to this person, but we still have a responsibility to them. One more point I want to make about where we are in this crisis. Matt Lauer, that's easy. Roger Ailes is easy. These situations where there is clear and decisive action are the defensible ones from a reputational standpoint. We can get past those. The ones that are harder are the ones that are facing organizations of all shapes and sizes that fall in that gray area. I'll give you another example, and this is something I've worked on. It's one of the most challenging ones we've worked on within this scope. An organizational, I won't say what kind of organization it was, but one of their employees posts on her private Facebook page that I was harassed by my previous supervisor at such and such at one of my last jobs. There was an incident in a hotel. They harassed me. They abused me. I don't want to say any more. So she has friends in every single organization. These are fairly small organizations that she previously worked. Everyone sees it. The first job she had says, oh, she's talking about Paul. The second job she has says, oh, she's talking about Steve. Third job she says, oh, she's talking about Hank. Okay. And everyone is presuming that they know the person having been accused. So my client reached out to this person, and I think it was the advisable thing to do, and what we advised her to do. They reached out, they had a private investigator, they had someone who's skilled at this, who's compassionate, and said, listen, this is your story to tell. however you want to tell it. We just want to give you a resource. If there's anything we can learn from your experience that's going to help us do our job and care for people in our care, we'd like to do that. And she didn't want to. So now you have 3 or 4 different organizations who all have this cultural understanding that they have an abuser within their ranks. We have nothing actionable. We have nothing decisive. And there's no opportunity for proving the negative and absolving anyone. That's the Me Too crisis that causes persistent, ongoing, lingering reputational harm, and that needs persistent, turning of the knobs and tweaking to actually succeed through and live through. And that's the one that's not dominating the headlines, but is nonetheless eroding cultures.
Joel? Charlie?
First,
You guys
I
pick
thought I
one.
was going to be able to take this off.
Yeah. There you go.
I think with respect to this, I think the first thing that everybody in this room has to do is get out of the mindset that it doesn't happen in my shop. It does happen in your shop. 2017, Washington Post ABC poll said that of the women that they spoke to, 35% of them said that they were sexually harassed by a person who had control over their job. It happens. It's happening in companies every day. And whether it's women, LGBT status, religion, body type, harassment is occurring. And we have to deal with it before it happens or as it's happening. So I think we need to train our people constantly. I think Joel's point about having diversity is the best thing that you can possibly do. But you've got to train people as to what New York now requires that you do training. And I think New Jersey is not far behind New York, saying that you have to do training. I think then you have to let everyone in the organization know that this is important from the top, right? If the top people pay lip service to it, then it's going to happen. And so there was a time, and I read this in the paper, there was the head of an organization walked into the harassment training and went up to the microphone and he said, remember, harass is one word, right? What that signaled to everybody in that organization was it's open season to harass people. I mean, how someone could have said that is crazy. It's vitally important that the top part of the organization let it be known that you will have a zero tolerance policy for this. It won't happen and it will be dealt with swiftly. Then I think when somebody makes a report about it, I think where a lot of companies make a mistake, and this may sound like a commercial for me, but they let HR handle it. And in most organizations, the employees think that HR is just a vehicle of management. And so if HR is handling it, if they come out one side, the other part of the organization is going to be upset. If they come out the other side, the perception is going to be there. 94% of the people who are harassed, of women who are harassed, feel that they were affected by this, but it did not affect the man in the situation. That the man was able to continue on in their career. And we saw that most recently with Katie Brennan in New Jersey. It was a woman who finally stood up and said, you know what? I thought it was crazy that this person who I'm alleging did bad things to me was continuing on, and somebody thought that I should not work for the state. So I'm going to be here and I'm going to let this be known. That's a very courageous woman, but not everybody wants to do that, but they should have that ability to do that. So I think it's important that when you have these allegations made, that you go out and you hire an outside third party to do the investigation, so that when the investigation is done, you can basically say, we brought in an objective organization to look at this. If you do it in-house, you're doing it in-house. You're saving a few bucks, but you're doing it at your peril.
Joel?
Really quickly, I think Charlie made a really great point that I want to pick up on. Thinking about how executives view this versus kind of like not just your rank and file, but kind of middle management, which is where a lot of people fall. And Charlie and I were talking about this before the panel even started. Executives come in and torpedo the best laid plans. We see it all the time. Being the middle people have done the due diligence. They've done the work to make sure that they've got, the right, efficiencies in place. They've got the right strategies in place. But then the crisis happens, the thing happens, and the executive comes in and says, nope, we got to do this, this, and this. And no one in the room feels empowered to stand up or to kind of back everything up, which is why it's so important that you really have a really cogent, unified crisis plan in advance, and that you've drilled this stuff and you understand it. And by the way, that the head of the crisis team is not necessarily the head of the organization. That's right. And that you might also have a rotating head of the crisis team. For instance, if it's an HR issue, obviously it makes sense to have somebody from that job function in more of a position of control. If it's a communication issue, vice versa. If it's a financial issue, CFO, so on and so forth. So I always, try to point that out. One of the things I always see is these executives who are really smart and able people, but because they don't have necessarily the time to sit in a 3-week crisis seminar per se, they come in and they torpedo your best laid plans, and I think that's important to elevate as well.
And the room always likes it when you trash the upper management.
We're all trying to get there.
All right, so we are right about at 9:30, and to the Q&A portion of this. So we have a mic over here. You have 3 experts in the area. You can speak in hypotheticals if you'd like. Here is your chance to gather information about a problem that you see in your own institution, or a problem that you might be experiencing, or I always say a friend of mine, and fill in the question. So if you want to get started, any questions here?
Doug Brown, Paradigm Associates. So here, one of the things I've heard recently is that, and I want to kind of tie this bridge, if you will, with the Me Too crisis and kind of going forward. With the Me Too crisis, some senior execs have been advised specifically no more one-on-one meetings with females, period. And I guess my question is, how long can that continue before that pendulum is going to go swinging the other direction with lawsuits saying, hey, wait a minute, you're willing to go out and have one-on-one meetings with other executives, but you're not willing to have one-on-one meetings with me, and therefore I'm not getting the same developmental opportunities and so on. And I can kind of see how that's going to start. If it hasn't started already, I can see where that could really be inflamed, and it's almost going to put people. My fear is that it's going to put people in a I'm damned if I do and I'm damned if I don't.
So let me ask the panel. Do you recommend that men don't have one-on-one meetings with women or any one of a particular protected class?
Yeah.
Chris?
It's the Mike Pence style of only if your wife's present can you meet with. No, listen. I think sort of building off of what Joel was saying earlier. I think trying to enforce measures like that is trying to put a procedural Band-Aid around a flawed culture. If you have a culture that recognizes diversity of viewpoints and recognizes humanity and operates within good judgment, theoretically, one shouldn't need to put such restrictions in place. Those seem to take hold when there are deep cultural flaws, and we need to work around them, and we need to cement ways to work around them. So I think putting in procedures like that is oftentimes a Band-Aid and also misdirected when one should be looking at how they can improve the diversity of viewpoints in their culture and not limit risk.
Anybody else?
If you're gonna if you're gonna have different rules for different people, then you're automatically creating subclasses, and you can't do that. Secondly, I would caution everybody not to let the lawyers run the game here, because the lawyers are always going to look at everything through the lens of litigation, and that is not always the best way to run your company. In fact, I would argue that in most ways it's not the way to run your company. So if you're not doing anything wrong, that doesn't mean that people won't sue you, but if you have a corporate culture that is positive, people are going to react to that corporate culture. And if you take a zero tolerance policy towards any kind of predatory behavior, the predators are going to leave and go somewhere else.
I would just say this. If there is a room where a male cannot be trusted with a young woman, then you probably got the wrong male in that room. So that's just a good way to look at it. Just a thought, just to kind of start this off. Now, look, that said, there's common sense. Okay, there are situations that are probably best, if possible, to be avoided. If there is a one-on-one meeting, yeah, it's probably a good idea to either have an opportunity for both of those folks to, have an outlet, right? Whether it's the door open or whether there's a reporting structure in place to where if something untoward were to happen, that somebody feels empowered and compelled to report it. But this gets back to a point that I made earlier, crisis culture. It's just about like common sense, and crisis culture isn't meant to suggest you should be stressed out and constantly worried about crisis, but it does mean that you should be thoughtful about the things that could happen. And that's, again, one of my earlier comments was, if you're reacting to this stuff after it's happened, really at that point, you're just mitigating losses. You're not actually protecting your assets. You're spending money at that point to only lose 5% of market share as opposed to 10% of market share. That's right. So to the extent that you can think about that ahead of time and be thoughtful about creating the type of culture that it's okay for men and women to have a one-on-one meeting in, or that people feel empowered to report things up, that a young woman would feel empowered to report something up to a male supervisor, right? So that, yes, it's important for her to have a female supervisor that she can appeal to, but that there's a culture where the male supervisors will do the right thing. I think those are all important things too, and those are important cultural things that need to be built in over time.
Any other questions?
Hi, everybody. Marcy Sasso, Sasso Consulting. My first time here, so thank you. My question is, when you say crisis, do we get a handle on, so for example, I have nurses in one of my centers who have about the same experience. One, I guess, was a male, got paid better pay. It is now coming around the loop that he's gotten paid quite a bit more. So do you jump on this ahead of time? Do you pull the two people in? Because you can't tell them not to talk about it, right? That's part of our
That's a
culture
new law.
now.
You're not allowed to ask.
So
You're not allowed
how
to
do
say
we
no.
get a handle on this when many of us are finding out, right, that some of these people are not making the same? Maybe it's male, maybe it's not, maybe it's, you're a buddy of so-and-so and you're hired. How do you suggest that we get a handle before it really is a crisis?
So, and I know NJBIZ has done a lot on that exact issue, but let's turn it over. So the problem is this: you find out that you have a problem in your organization. A man is getting paid exponentially more money for no real reason. In other words, there's an obvious violation of the legislation, the new legislation. How would you handle it?
One of the things that I did when I went to the Schools Development Authority, which is a state agency, when I got there, I won't say it's the first thing, but within the first month, I wanted to see a grid of what everybody was paid. So what their jobs were and how much money they were making. And I saw disparities between men and women. And I sat down with my HR folks and I said, now we have to fix it. And we did. Well, let's say we minimized the problem. And so we gave raises to a lot of the women who I felt were underpaid. Now, those women were good about it because they could have said, wait a second, this has been going on for however long this is. I want the back pay. What I found was they were happy enough that somebody saw the problem and was setting about to deal with the problem. So it was a problem averted for me.
I also think, it's an interesting strategy to think about in terms of kind of owning, I come from politics, so I think about things from a political lens. Bill Clinton's old phrase, you hang a lantern on your biggest problems. In other words, if that's something that's been endemic to your culture, it might make sense to think about, well, how do we proactively turn this around and turn it into a business advantage? In other words, to own our past and to own the flaws of the past and say, we did this the wrong way for a long time. Guess what? It's a new day. So don't be secretive necessarily about it, and don't, try to kind of shield yourself from some of the potential shame that might come from that in the past. I'd argue it's actually a business strategy to own it, to be a leader, to be a thought leader, and to take it as an opportunity to really set the trend in the right direction in the space. So again, it's about attitude, and it's about making sure that you have the right perspective in terms of how you want to approach the public about it.
No, it's well said, and I won't add much to it other than to say that there's sort of a principle in our practice, which is that you just can't You can't perfume manure. And if the reality isn't good,
Say
then
that again. Wait a minute. Say that again on the video.
I'll look right into it. You can't perfume manure. Public relations doesn't, no amount of communications makes unfortunate situations seem good. So get to the root of it. I think Joel's recommendation is spot on there.
Embrace it. But also in the world in New Jersey, and the law is very specific. You must, in that situation, consult an attorney in employment law. You'd be at your peril if you don't. Mm-hmm. Get clear legal guidance because the legislation is very clear as to what you have to do. Another panel on another issue for another day. Anyone else? Any other questions? One over here. Oh, one over here.
Sure, it's David Stein, Mullens, Goldman, and Spitzer. I'm involved in banking and creditors' rights. I've represented several companies in Chapter 11 that have been accused of criminality. How do you balance the needs of the board dealing with the vendors, dealing with the outside crisis, whether an investigation? There's so many issues tugging at you where you want to try to keep the organization together, the employees together, the morale going. How quickly are you bringing the crisis management people in, and what are your steps to get the right message out there?
All right, which one of you want that one?
To be honest, I'll say that I'm bringing the crisis management
Yeah.
people in right away, right? And in fact, I hopefully they had been working even before, because there's a lot of decision making that goes up to filing for Chapter 11, and I think that you have to manage a Chapter 11 filing well before you actually file, so that you start getting people into that and you message early on. And then once you do it, you're going to find that you need different messages to different constituents. There's not one message fits all here. And that you've got to deal with it. And then you have to do a lot of personal hand-holding. Like, all the messaging doesn't have to be in public, but there has to be a lot of meetings with people to let people feel comfortable about continuing to do business with you, about your employees continuing to stay with you, and how you're going to do this.
Yeah, I mean, Chapter 11. Did I cut you off, Joel? I'm sorry. Chapter 11 is I kind of touched on this earlier, but it's always a compounding factor, like any other financial crisis. It's how does this fit in with people's current perception of us? This is one in a series of regular financial flags. What's the impact on morale from that standpoint for the employees? If you're in the healthcare field and you file Chapter 11, just poll your market on your perceived quality the day before, and then poll them again the day after, and you'll see a significant drop-off in the perception of quality, and then you see a drop-off in utilization and reimbursements. So it has that compounding effect. So it really does depend on what the organization is and what its sort of compounding factors are. As far as the board question, from a communicator standpoint, one tiny sort of tactical thing I'll say about the board, to build on something I said earlier, is we try to, if we're informing the board we're having a plan for a leak, and if we're informing the board we're trying to limit the amount of time between the board's notice and the greater community's notice, knowing that the potential of it leaking is far worse than if it's originating from us.
Just one thing I'll add, I think it's always important to just kind of try to keep these things as simple as possible. Mm-hmm. When I think about, your question really talking about, well, how do you balance the needs of the board versus some of the other stakeholders? I mean, who's the most important stakeholder? I'd say it's your customers. I'd say because there is no board, there are no investors, it's your customers. That's your pipeline to the world. That's your revenue source. That's really everything. And so I think earning buy-in internally, so working with those different stakeholder groups to sell them on a strategy is important. So taking the appropriate time at the front end to sell everybody on, this is our strategy and this is why. Not just going and doing it, but actually doing some of the homework and some of the grunt work to get people to buy into a strategy could help be an effective solve in that type of a situation.
Yeah, one more quick tactical thing to build on something Joel was saying. One of the things we do when we're facing a milestone like that is we'll break out, as most do, every single audience that we touch to the narrowest possible metric. We know who's going to be responsible for communicating with each one. You generally want a consistent message, but not just with your board, not just with your employees, not just with your customers, the people that utilize your services, with your elected officials, with your neighbors. We want every audience broken out. There may be tens, there may be hundreds. Know who's communicating with them and how, and focus on trying to do it in the most humane and compassionate way, knowing that people are not necessarily going to look at this logically, they're going to process it emotionally.
And if you manage a crisis well, you're going to actually be stronger because of it. And people are going to look at you as a company that's resilient. So if you look at Johnson & Johnson, the way they handled the Tylenol problem years ago by pulling all of the Tylenol off, saying our customers are vitally important to us and we're not going to take any chances, they now have a stronger reputation in that area because most people look at Johnson & Johnson as a company that has values and that is going to protect them. And so they faced an incredibly traumatic crisis. They came through it well, and I think their reputation was actually enhanced by the way in which they managed that.
That's a good point. Very good point. One last question.
Denise Pace Sanders, and I'm with PPAC Gladstone Bank. Sort of self-serving question here, but you brought up Wells Fargo, basically saying they got it wrong. What would you each specifically have told them or directed them to do to get it right?
I know you raised it.
Right, I raised it. I think what they had to do a number of things. I think that they should have been proactively managing the company to see where they were vulnerable. They were vulnerable in the way that they had their compensation package set up, and they should have seen that before the problem. Once the problem happened in '93, they should have dealt with it then, but they didn't. They waited until '96 when the problem became much larger. They didn't see the crisis for what it was when it was. So you've got to be able to do that. Then when the crisis hit, they did not message it properly. They did not take, in my mind, they did not take the proper view. They sent the CEO in to the Senate without good messaging. And he looked very bad. It looked as though the company tried originally to blame the low-level people at the branches for this. They said they did a terrible thing. The company should have owned that problem from the get-go. It was their problem. And I think when people saw a guy who made $60, $70 million and got huge bonuses, blaming the tellers who were making $12 an hour for taking advantage of a compensation package that they put in to deal with onerous requirements that they put in, that made Wells Fargo look even worse. And it went against what Wells Fargo had touted as their corporate credo for many years. So they had a cascading problem. I think also they didn't get their arms around the total problem, and they constantly had to bleed out things that we were doing. So in many instances, they did what I would say people shouldn't do. First, you need to look at your organization and see where your vulnerabilities are, and then deal with those vulnerabilities. Then, you need to have a plan in place, and you need to message right, and also you need to, when you have a problem, do an internal investigation and find out where all of the skeletons are, and let those skeletons out. They kind of didn't do any of those things. Now, if they were sitting here, they may educate me as to what they did do, because it's always Monday morning quarterback, and it's a lot easier for me to say that now. But if you look back, there was a number of things I think that they could have done better.
Well, really quickly, I agree with everything Charlie said, but I also try to avoid the Monday morning quarterbacking, especially other communicators. And I think a lot of the actions were so indefensible that no amount of communications would have really necessarily made great headway. But I just from a purely messaging standpoint, there's a difference between saying I'm sorry and I already said I'm sorry. And I think there was a little too much, I already said I'm sorry, and not enough I'm sorry. And if you still have that, if you still feel that sentiment, just say that sentiment. Don't worry about justifying that I've already checked that box.
The only thing it's funny too. The only thing I'd add is to be thoughtful about your brand and about what your brand DNA currently is and how it should be reflected in your messages and in how you communicate. I echo the points here about the perils of Monday morning quarterbacking, but I will say One thing I think they have done well is they've done a big ad campaign after the fact, talking about their history and embracing that as a part of the "my bad" message, and as I call it colloquially. And I would say just try to think about your brand, and again, I talk about that Corpsumer survey that I discussed earlier that we do at MWWPR, and it's just so important to be mindful of that and thoughtful about that as you're approaching these things. Well, what do people look to us for? What do they count on us for? Okay, let's be consistent and let's build off of that equity that's already established and that's already in place. That will help amplify your responses. If you start doing things that are off-brand, or you start doing things that are inconsistent with your history, or that don't line up with who you have tried to sell yourself as, that's where you get yourself in a problem.
I think the one rule you can have for all of these things is don't act in a way that would make your mother embarrassed. That's really it.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, so we are at the point where we get to wrap up. I want to try to summarize the last 45 minutes, and understanding that this has only been 30,000-foot view, but what I've heard and what I think everybody agrees on is prepare for the worst now.
For the best.
Right? Plan, train, and practice all the time. Keep one of these guys or all of these guys on speed dial, because they'll help you plan, train, and practice. And then follow their advice, because they are the experts in disasters of all levels and all sorts. There's probably, between the three of these gentlemen up here, nothing they haven't seen or heard before. And then finally, I'm going to use something I stole out of what Charlie McKenna sent to me, and this is that no plan is perfect, but having no plan is a disaster. So with that, I want to say thank you to all of you for coming out today. I want to especially thank our sponsors, and I'm going to turn it back over to NJBIZ. Howard, come on up. Oh, yeah, well, you're going to thank everybody, right? All right. We didn't have it exactly scripted out.
I want to thank our panelists for obviously a very informed and important discussion. So please give a round of applause to our panelists. And a special round of applause for our moderator, Lieutenant Governor Kim Guadagno. Coverage of our panel discussion this morning will appear on njbiz.com this afternoon and in the December 17th edition of the newspaper. You can also see a video of today's presentation on our YouTube channel, which will be posted shortly. Our next panel discussion, and our last one for the year, is scheduled for December 18th. The topic, Women in Business, and it'll be right here in this room with the same great breakfast. So we please ask for all of you to come and show up and hear our panelists discuss that wide-ranging topic. And if you're not familiar with NJBIZ and you want to be, we can sign you up for a free subscription so you can get a sense of what we do on a weekly basis. Please see Anna Acquaviva over there at the table, and she'll take care of you. Again, I want to thank everybody here for coming today. Have a great day, and we'll see you at our next panel discussion. Thank you.